make our no-bake cookies, we need just a few simple ingredients. We'll need some oats, peanut butter, and cocoa. We'll need salt, vanilla, sugar, margarine, and milk. The equipment that we'll need to make our no-bake cookies includes a saucepan. We'll need some measuring equipment, dry measuring cups, a cup and a half cup. We'll need a liquid measuring cup, custard cups, measuring spoons. It's important that you have a timer because time is very sensitive with this particular recipe. We're also going to need a straight edge spatula, a wooden spoon, and a rubber scraper. If you have it, a cookie scoop can be really handy for this recipe as well. As a part of our recipe for no-bake cookies today, we're going to talk about some important concepts that apply to almost every time that you cook. One of those is the term mise en place. Mise en place literally means to put in place, but if we dig into the definition of mise en place a little more, it means having all the foods and equipment ready before beginning, or even that state of mental readiness before you prepare the recipe. So reading it through entirely before you begin doing the first step is a very important part of mise en place and a very important part of recipe success. We're also going to change the quantities in the original recipe, and we're going to cut this recipe in half. We do this for class purposes, mostly because of time, so that we can get everything done and cleaned up and back out the door. But knowing those abbreviations and those equivalents so that you can recognize them or make changes with the recipe is also a very important skill when preparing foods. So let's start with our granulated sugar. Originally, the recipe calls for 2 cups of granulated sugar, but since we're going to cut the recipe in half, we only need 1 cup. And if you recall, I've said before that sugar is probably one of the easiest ingredients to measure. Granulated sugar, that is, because all we have to do is simply scoop it up and level it off. And then we have our 1 cup of sugar that we'll need for this recipe. Our next ingredient on the list is originally 3 tablespoons of unsweetened cocoa. So it's important to know that to get 3 tablespoons cut in half, you need to know how many teaspoons are in a tablespoon, because we'll need 1 tablespoon and half a tablespoon, and most measuring spoon sets do not have a half tablespoon measure. So we need to be able to remember that there are 3 teaspoons in a tablespoon, and so half of 3 tablespoons will be 1 tablespoon and 1.5 teaspoons. So I'm going to simply scoop up, just like I did the granulated sugar, this cocoa, and level it off. So there's my tablespoon. Remember, that's the biggest in the set, because you can remember that because a table is bigger than a teacup. And a teaspoon and a half teaspoon. Okay, so there I put that in a custard cup to set it aside, and I have my cocoa. The original recipe for this calls for a pinch of salt, and so literally I'm just going to take a pinch, just a smaller one than I might have, and I'll put that in with the cocoa because they go into the pan at the same time. And then we need originally a half cup of margarine, and remember, we always cook with sticks, and instead we're going to use a 1/4 cup. So we're going to measure this margarine using the stick method, where we use the markings on the wrapper to know a 1/4 cup. And so the markings often will give us a reminder that a 1/4 cup is 4 tablespoons. So we want to make sure that we have 1, 2, 3, 4 tablespoons, which will be half a stick of margarine. So we'll need that. And then our next ingredient is a half cup of milk. So we need a liquid measuring cup placed on a level surface. And then I'm gonna pour, the original recipe was a 1/2 cup of milk, so that means we need a 1/4 cup. So I'm gonna pour milk in to what I believe is the line. And then I'm gonna come down to eye level to make sure that that's correct. And if I need a little more, I'll add it, and if I have too much, I'll pour off the excess. So there's my 1/4 cup of milk. Now, the original recipe called for 3 cups of rolled oats. So instead of 3 cups, we'll cut that in half and we'll use 1.5 cups of oats. We're going to use rolled oats. You could use quick oats if that's what you had at home. And again, we just scoop these up, level it off. So there's a 1/2 cup. Use my spatula to push some of them in here. It's so full, it's difficult to get that cup measured all the way full. So I'm just going to use another measuring cup and add some. You could use a spoon, same purpose. And then I'm going to just level that off gently with the spatula. So now I have 1.5 cups of oats. And now probably the toughest ingredient to measure is peanut butter. Originally, this recipe calls for a 1/2 cup of peanut butter. But since we're cutting the recipe in half, we're going to just measure 1/4 cup. So to measure my peanut butter, I need 1/4 cup. And it's important to remember that it would be measured in a dry measuring cup, not a liquid measuring cup like the milk. But I have this extra special tool in the kitchen here that I love called the Wonder Cup. And so I'm going to measure my peanut butter in that. I'm going to press the inside piece down to 1/4 cup because that's what I need, 1/2 cup. I'm going to take my peanut butter, I'm going to hold the bottom of this outer piece on the Wonder Cup so it doesn't move. Take my peanut butter, fill it in. Use the straight side of that scraper to level it off. And now I have the peanut butter that I need for this recipe. So the last ingredient that I need to prepare my no-bake cookies is vanilla extract. And the original recipe called for a teaspoon. And remember, when measuring small amounts of liquids, we need to measure over and a hold, or if you're in class, a carry back, because we need to have that bubble at the edge. So originally it was a teaspoon, but since we're cutting the recipe in half, we need a 1/2 teaspoon. So I'm going to measure, I'm going to add the vanilla to the measuring spoon until it bubbles at the edge and it's ready to fall out of the measuring spoon. And so that didn't, so I can put it right into the cup I measured over and I don't have any excess. So now that we have all of our ingredients put together, we've mise en place the ingredients. We need to make sure that we do the same for our equipment. So again, that concept of mise en place is really important. It means setting up your work area prior to preparation time. It includes chopping herbs and spices if they go into your recipe, or in a baking recipe, you might have things like nuts or even raisins that have to be chopped. Getting your mind ready to work or bake. And again, the most important part of that is reading the recipe itself. Now we'll start to put this together in the saucepan. Mise en place is an important part of every recipe, but it is particularly important for this recipe that you have everything measured and ready to go and all equipment set up before you start anything, because once that mixture hits that rapid boil that we'll talk more about in a minute, it's everything happens very quickly from there and you don't have time to go get something or prepare something. So I even have my my pan here lined with wax paper that I'm going to scoop them out onto, and I have my cookie scoop ready to go. If you didn't have a cookie scoop, you could just use a regular spoon like you use at your table, and then a rubber scraper to push it off of the spoon onto the wax paper lined pan. So we're going to look for this to come to a rapid boil. And I'm going to talk about these things before I start, because again, once I start putting things together, it goes pretty quickly usually. So that rapid boil is big bubbles continuously breaking the surface, and you can't stir it away. And this recipe is really tricky. The timer is a super important piece of equipment for this one, because it's the boiling. This is the tricky part, the boiling. If you boil it too long, the cookies become dry and crumbly, and at best you've got a delicious ice cream topping. But if you don't boil it long enough, they won't form properly, and they're just a big wad of goo all over your pan. So it has to be just right for your cookies to turn out. So I've got my peanut butter measured and my vanilla measured before I begin to cook as a part of that mise en place preparation. And I chose to measure my peanut butter in the Wonder Cup. My vanilla is waiting in a custard cup on the other side. My oats are over there as well, because they're not one of the first ingredients that go into this recipe. Now I'm using wax paper on my tray, but you could use parchment paper. Parchment paper just costs a little bit more per square inch, so I like the wax paper. It doesn't have to go in the oven, so the wax paper works great and is a lot cheaper than the parchment paper. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started with our recipe. And we need our granulated sugar. So I have a 3-quart saucepan. You could get by with a 2-quart saucepan, but I like the extra space to help it not boil over. I need my cocoa and salt. Make sure that all gets in there. The cocoa likes to cling to the cup. So I make sure that gets put into the pan. I'm going to add my 1/4 cup of margarine. That half of a stick is a 1/4 cup. And then I'm also going to add the milk. Put all those things together. And now that they're all together, I'm going to go ahead and turn the pan on to a medium heat. Medium heat would be a 5 or a 6. And then I'm going to begin to stir. Now, if we were in class, we would take some extra time a day before we prepared these to mise en place a couple of the ingredients. We would measure ahead of time, sort of like making our own no-bake cookie mix. And so we'd measure our oats and put those in a separate bag. And we could put the sugar, cocoa powder, and salt all together in a bag as well. So we'd have 2 bags, and then we'd pick up the semi-solid peanut butter and the liquid milk and vanilla on the day we actually cooked. We'd add those. If we needed to speed up the cooling time for these, we could certainly put them in the refrigerator. It's best if you can let them chill or set at room temperature. But if you need them in a hurry, the refrigerator is an option. If you look back, you can see we didn't need a lot of equipment for this recipe. We needed a 1-cup liquid measuring cup, a Wonder Cup if you have it, rubber scraper, a couple of custard cups, some measuring spoons, and some dry measuring cups for those dry ingredients. Of course, if we mise en placed a day ahead, we wouldn't need those dry measuring cups on day 2. So you can see the margarine's already starting to melt. It's coming together as one homogeneous mixture. And we just need to cut it to come to a rapid boil. And remember, that's those big bubbles that break the surface and you can't stir them away. Before that happens, we'll see all of our margarine melted as well. And these are really simple to store. You can just put them in a plastic bag or sandwich baggies. If your family really loves them, you might need to divide them up at the beginning and give each person their own baggie of cookies. Alright, so we've got our margarine just about melted. And you can see our pan is not quite boiling yet. But I am going to stir this constantly. I don't want anything to burn to the bottom of the pan. So it's important that I cover the entire surface of the pan in my stirring so that nothing can get stuck. You can see I already have 1 minute and 15 seconds ready to go on my timer. So as soon as I get that rapid boil, I'll push start. If I pause, I can see the surface is starting to create a few smaller bubbles. So that means we're getting closer. So you can see I'm starting to get a lot of bubbles covering the surface. I really can't stir them away. So I'm going to start my timer. 1 minute and 15 seconds. I'm going to stir just this. And I'm going to stir quickly as well, because this is when it is really likely to burn to the bottom of the pan. And I want to make sure that that does not happen. See how those bubbles don't go away no matter how much I stir? They're always there around in the pan. About 30 more seconds. And these will be ready for the next step. So coming up, we're going to add the peanut butter first because it's the hardest thing to get in and we need the most heat. Once the timer goes off, we're going to turn the burner off, but we're going to leave the pan on so no new heat will be created. We're stirring the peanut butter and the vanilla and then the oats. And then we're going to quickly scoop it onto our lined baking pan, onto our wax paper. All right, here we go. So I turned the heat off. I'm pushing the peanut butter into the recipe. I'm going to stir that in quickly. So that it melts. And then once the peanut butter's all in there, I'm going to go ahead and add the vanilla. And once that's pretty well mixed in, I'm going to add my oats. Get those all coated. And then we're ready to start putting them on the parchment paper or the wax paper. The original recipe for this yields 24, so we should be able to get at least 12 cookies out of here. How many you get out is going to depend on how big you scoop them. So the larger you scoop them, the fewer cookies that you get. Scrape that pan as best we can with the cookie scoop. I'm going to scrape it with my rubber scraper. Get everything I can out of there into one last odd cookie. And then if we'd like them to be a little bit flatter, we can press those with the rubber scraper into more of a cookie shape, or you can leave them mounded up, whatever you prefer really for the look on this cookie. All right, so there's our no-bake cookies ready to go. You can see there's a difference between these two cookies. They came from two different batches. Ingredients were the same and time on the timer was the same. The difference was when the timer was started. The cookie on the left was allowed to boil a little bit longer before the timer was started than the cookie on the right. So the cookie on the right is your ideal look. It's does not look dried out, but it holds together, and it's not just a pile of goo. So this is definitely a recipe where the more often you make it, the better you get at making it, because judging that boiling time is key. So if you do choose to make the no-bake cookies and they don't come out quite right the first time, I do encourage you to try again and change the timing on when you start the boiling, the timer for the boiling, to fit whatever direction you need to go to make your cookie look more ideal. They're really delicious cookies, and so they're well worth the time that you put into them, especially since they don't require a lot of time and they don't heat up your kitchen.